Hi, everybody. This is Kit Merker here from Noble 9, and I'm talking to William Morgan. He's the CEO of Buoyant, and he's also the creator of Linkerd and Dive. Say hi, William.
Hey everyone. Hi, Kit.
So, William, your company's been in the service mesh space for quite a while, specifically Linkerd, and you contributed that back to CNCF back in 2017. So, 3 years later, are you happy with that decision? And I'd kind of like to hear your view, kind of the state of the industry. What do people need to know about the state of the industry in service mesh?
Yeah, so we've been in it from the very beginning because Linkerd was the project that introduced the term service mesh to the world. So there was literally no service mesh before Linkerd. There's a long history behind all that stuff, which I won't go into. But you're right. So we kicked, I think the original version we launched 0.1 or something back in 2016, and very shortly after, early 2017, donated Linkerd to the CNCF. So I would say you asked if that was good. Yes, that was very good for Linkerd. It was good because we have a very specific goal with Linkerd, which involves, effectively giving up control of kind of large portions of the project. That's kind of specific to our business strategy. I think if we had a different strategy around Linkerd, then we would not have wanted to do this, and it would have been bad to do that. But for us, in a world where what we care about is Linkerd adoption and everyone feeling good about, getting on the Linkerd train, yeah, it's been great. It's been really good, And it was like project number 4 or something, or 5. It's like Kubernetes, Prometheus, something, Linkerd. It's like, oh, this is awesome.
And when you look at the state of the industry, though, with service mesh, where are we in the cycle? Is it mature? Are we early? Where are we?
Yeah, so there it's kind of hard to give a really simple answer because, Linkerd has been in production for years at this point. It's like over, 3 plus, probably close to 4 years. So on the one hand, I feel very confident that yes, we're in a great, everything's good. There's large companies that are relying on this thing every day, to do really significant things. On the other hand, the service mesh ecosystem, I think as a whole, definitely feels more raw and early because there's a lot of noise and a lot of hype in it. It doesn't feel very mature, I think, coming into it from the outside.
So yeah, so that kind of segues into the news I want to talk about a little bit and get your take on this. So last week, as people may know, Google announced that Istio, along with 2 other projects, will be joining a newly formed foundation called the Open Usage Commons, and not going to the CNCF. And the idea is that this would be a neutral home for the trademarks for those projects. But I saw a blog post from Jason McGee, who's the VP CTO of IBM Cloud, and he said that this move doesn't live up to the community's expectation of open governance. And I'm quoting there. What do you think?
Yeah, so part of me is just like sitting off in the sidelines, snacking on popcorn and like watching what happens. I think there's a couple things going on, and obviously I, I'm not involved in the Istio project in any kind of direct way. In fact, my interactions with the Istio team have been really good. They've been positive. Everyone's been very professional and so on. I think there's a couple things going on. The first is I think that IBM statement was really interesting because that was a partner, someone who was involved with Istio very early on saying, hey, this is not what we agreed. This is like going off the rails. So I think there's a level of this that's purely like, why did you do this, Google? Why are you kind of hurting, kind of these unforced errors? Why are you doing this to your partners who I think are a very valuable part of Istio, the ecosystem and so on? I think beyond that, there's a section of, I think, the adopter community who's just like, well, who cares? Like, it's like, I don't really care if it's hosted by this foundation or that one or, trademark, blah, blah, blah. Like, the thing works, it solves problems for me, we're going to use it. But I think outside of that group, there's kind of an increasing sophistication when it comes to consumption of open source, where there's kind of a realization, hey, even though this thing is free and we have the source code to it, like it's not a static thing. Software is not static. When we're incurring this software dependency in our stack, we are incurring a dependency not on the software as it is today, but on kind of the process around it. And once you're in that mindset, then you start caring a lot about things like governance and trademark ownership and stuff, because that's what's going to affect you in the future, even if it's not what's affecting you right now.
So you talked, just to drill on that a little bit. So you talked about the sophistication that's coming from customers. Where is that coming from? Is it a general education? Is it a realization that open source is reality now? Where do you think the sophistication around the buyer decision? Where did this? What's the source of that?
Yeah, I think this is part and parcel of kind of the maturity of open source as a, as kind of a consumption vehicle. Early on, right, open source was, people in their basements kind of contributing together and we're doing this to stick it to like the corporate man, like down with Microsoft, we're going to make Linux. And that was perfect for me as a teenager. Maybe I'm dating myself. I was like, yeah, let's do this. Whereas now, the relationship between kind of the commercial world and the open source world is very, very different, much more sophisticated. And yes, open source is like a reality. It's for many of us in the infrastructure world especially, it is the de facto, like everything is open source. Kubernetes is open source, Linux is open source, every Docker is open source, everything we're using in our stack is open source. So I think because of that, the awareness and kind of sophistication and what that means has to evolve, because it's part and parcel of something very fundamental we're doing to our software stack.
So I want to go a little bit deeper on this too, because at the beginning you kind of talked a little bit about the specific business strategy that your company is pursuing around open source, right? And that it's important to your company to go with the CNCF to try to drive adoption. There's also, open source isn't what it used to be, and there's nuance to it. There's a variety of different methods, and I think the sophistication you're talking about is also, not all open source is created equally. I would say, right? It's not all governed equally. What do you think some of the key, trade-offs or things that are evolving in how business and open source kind of either fit together or are hurting each other? What are you seeing from that point of view? Maybe beyond service mesh or in service mesh, either way. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think about a whole lot because, I'm basically gambling everything on a particular answer here, right? My kid's college education is like gambling, is being gambled on, kind of this particular strategy around Linkerd. Boy, that sounds terrible when I say it that way. This particular strategy around Linkerd and open source. So, I wear two hats. I wear the Linkerd hat and then I wear the Buoyant hat. Buoyant is a startup. The point of a startup is to build a sustainable business model. And the kind of the technique we're using is to build this thing in open source. And the way that we're doing it is different because I think from what kind of traditional open source business models have been in the past, because I think, this is also tied with the nature of open source that's changing, the consumption of open source is changing, and the sophistication of the buyer. So for us, it's really important for Linkerd to be a first-class open source project that is not, tightly controlled by Buoyant, right? And that only makes sense in a world where the value that Buoyant is providing, like the commercial value that we are going to charge you money for, is decoupled from Linkerd in a way that does not, kind of make us withhold anything from Linkerd, right? Kind of the traditional open core model for open source is, we're going to withhold these features. I mean, there's 100 different ways to do open core, but like, the bad way is we're going to withhold these features. Oh yeah, you can use it, but if you want to go to production, well, you're going to need to buy this extra thing over here. Right? And that's not the model of the future. I don't think it's even really the model of the present anymore. So that's all to say our strategy around Buoyant is very much based on the strategy around Linkerd. It's that Linkerd has to be, a fully production ready thing that you can adopt, and you can adopt it in a way that doesn't involve Buoyant making money directly, and that's okay. That's okay.
So, you've been historically somewhat outspoken, I would say, about the service mesh industry, some of the difficulties with Istio specifically, and coming back to kind of the news around Istio, but more broadly around service mesh generally. What do you think is the biggest misconception about service meshes, especially as they relate to cloud infrastructure, Kubernetes project? How easy, how necessary, how expensive is really to do service mesh? What are people mistaken about that you want to clear up?
Yeah, so I guess I've been outspoken. I guess, let me restate a little bit what I said before, which is that, yes, I have a very particular relationship with Istio, which I'm going to tell you all my opinions about. But every interaction I've had with an Istio engineer, I have left with nothing but the sense that they're professional and that they're great engineers and that they know what they're doing. So, I don't think anywhere in here is like a real bad actor, and I don't think anywhere in here is anyone who is not a stellar kind of engineer, probably a much better engineer, honestly, than I ever was. All that said, my frustration in the service mesh space is that it has been so wrapped up with kind of the notion of complexity and and confusion and taking on a lot of stuff. Like the popular perception of the service mesh is that, man, this is a really complicated bunch of machinery. We just adopted Kubernetes, which has like 10,000 APIs. You know, we're barely able to operate that thing. Now you're asking us to add this other huge layer on there. And I think that perception is driven by Istio, right? And I think that, you know, whether that was intentional or not, that perception is, it's a real disservice to the cloud native kind of community as a whole, because the service mesh does not have to be complicated. The value props are very, very real. All the reliability and observability and security features, you know, they're super, super powerful. And when people get there, you know, you can see them like smile with relief if they have these things. But it's so tied up with complexity, and it doesn't have to be that way. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, my frustration with the service mesh ecosystem as a whole.
So you're saying that the perception of complexity is not generally true, but it's coming from it can't be coming directly from the Istio project themselves. I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you're saying that that people have tried using Istio and they've become frustrated with that project, and then they're generalizing that to all service meshes. Is that a fair way to characterize what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And, you know, Istio, I think by virtue of backing from Google and IBM and kind of all the partnerships around it, which is kind of a credit to it, also means it has a huge amount of marketing, you know, kind of power. And so, you know, we've seen a shift in the Linkerd world where, you know, 2017, 2018, people were coming to Linkerd and saying, hey, I need a service mesh. I heard about this great thing. Over the past couple of years, everyone who's coming to Linkerd has heard about the service mesh from Istio. And we have to like now untrain them. We have to say, hey, by the way, you actually can get mutual TLS, you know, without you having to enable anything, without having to do any configuration, just add it and like it works. And, you know, of course it's mind blowing. They love it, blah, 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 but it requires a bunch of education on our part to kind of, you know, remove the kind of, you know, wrong thinking that they've had by virtue of being introduced to it through Istio.
So maybe we can look to the future a little bit, because I think you're pointing out the kind of where we are today and some of the challenges and the marketing kind of leaning ahead of the technical realities perhaps in some cases. But when you look ahead at the possible futures, what do you think is likely, or what's possible for how this plays out? I mean, are you generally sort of optimistic that the best technology will win? Or do you think that there's a level playing field? Are the cynics right? How do you look at the future of the service mesh and open source and commercialization of software? How do you see it?
Yeah, so, you know, I can really speak to service mesh most specifically. I think what's interesting to me is that, you know, as much as I would like to say, yes, the best technology is going to win and Linkerd is the best technology, and therefore we're going to dominate the marketplace and everyone else is going to fall by our wayside. I'd love to be able to say that, but I don't really think that's true. I think the service mesh is actually a normal kind of open source playing field, right? Kubernetes was not normal. Kubernetes was weird because there was a winner who like won the marketplace, at least by popular consensus, right? The container orchestration wars were like, there was a single victor who emerged, you know, least unscathed. But the history of open source is very different. You know, you almost always have these alternative projects that are, you know, part of the ecosystem. And I think that's going to be true of the service mesh too. I think Istio and Linkerd and probably some other projects are going to be around for a long time. And, you know, there'll be different kind of reasons to do one or the other. And obviously mine is the best and you should always use mine. But I think the reality is, you know, it's going to be a multi-mesh world for the future. And I think that's okay. You know, I think that's, in fact, I think that's normal. And I think that's probably positive for the community as a whole. And certainly on the, you know, kind of putting on my Buoyant hat for a second, I also think that's fine, right? You know, there's nothing in the Buoyant mission statement that says we're gonna, you know, we're gonna use a service mesh to take over the world and then we're gonna do X, Y, and Z, right? It's more about how do we empower developers to, you know, have security and reliability in a way that, you know, anyone can access it. So it's actually fine. And I guess I have despite my frustrations, I actually have a pretty optimistic view of the world. Maybe in part because every day I come into this and I see people adopting Linkerd and they're like, you know, their lives are getting better, right? And that just makes me feel happy. And maybe that's what leads to my surprising optimism.
So you are optimistic, you would say.
Yeah, I mean, if we ignore the global pandemic and kind of, everything else that's happening, assuming that, the world continues to survive with humans in it, over the next 5 years, yes, I'm optimistic.
So, okay, that's great. Well, and I'm curious in that evolution, this multi-mesh future you talked about. How do you see the positioning in those different pieces? I mean, you've talked already about complexity versus simplicity, perhaps, and maybe striving for Linkerd to be kind of you just turn it on and it just works in the cluster and kind of that direction. Is that the idea, or is it something else? I mean, is it there's a service mesh for X scenario, a service mesh for Y scenario? What's X and Y? I guess if you were to think about the different possible positioning you could go down.
Yeah. So our strategy for Linkerd certainly is to make this the simplest, most lightweight service mesh available, and to reduce the operational complexity, right? Like, it's great to reduce CPU and memory, and like there's all sorts of cool stuff we could talk about with Rust, and but really the crucial thing in my mind is how much brain power do you as an operator have to spend like managing your service mesh? And that's the thing we try and reduce as much as possible. And that informs, like, that philosophy of simplicity informs everything we do with Linkerd. It informs the shape of the product and the features that we take on, that we don't take on, and so on. And that is a very explicit strategy on our part, because Linkerd is like, the way it gets adopted is bottom-up adoption, right? These are engineers on the ground who are like, whether they like it or not, are thrust into the world of like, you're building a platform on Kubernetes, figure out the rest. And they, like, they need to provide these things, like the security and reliability and observability features that the service mesh provides. They have to provide that to their customers, which are the developers in their organization. And so Linkerd has got to be the lightest, clearest, most obvious way to get to that point. But that's all tied to Linkerd being, kind of our focus being on bottom-up adoption, right? And I do believe that's the future of whatever, but of open source adoption and so on. If we had a giant sales team, a GCP like Anthos sales team that could kind of like, use account control to wrangle, people to adopt this technology, we would probably have a different focus, honestly, because the adoption mechanisms would be different. And I think it would be a worse focus, but that's my opinion, and I kind of have to have that opinion because, that's where I am. So yeah, I guess I'd say by virtue of the goals, to kind of summarize, by virtue of the goals of the projects and the adoption mechanisms, you will find the projects, the different service mesh options going in different directions, kind of naturally. Like that's going to happen. They're not all going to be equivalent all the time.
What I guess what I'm trying to get to is the specifics, if you will. Is there a specific difference? I mean, ease of use is fine. I understand that's something you can say. Okay, this product is easy to use. This product is harder to use. Time to value, whatever, however you want to measure it. But in terms of is it any Kubernetes cluster for any purpose? Add Linkerd and it will just be better, or is there actually like, okay, it's for data intensive apps, or it's for stateless, or it's for stateful data? Like, what are the kinds of use cases, I guess, if you were to drill into the next level of detail on this? Like, what are the use cases that would drive your project to say, yeah, this is a good fit for this, and this is what we're going to really focus on enabling, versus kind of being a general purpose, or maybe it is general purpose. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Okay, no, I see what you're asking. So for Linkerd specifically, the stuff that we can really help with, we can really add value to, is number one, you have to be on Kubernetes, and you have to be kind of Kubernetes first. You don't have to, your whole stack doesn't have to be Kubernetes. You have to kind of buy into the notion that this is how I want to operate stuff, because we make a whole lot of assumptions in Linkerd, in the interest of simplicity, to build on top of existing Kubernetes components. So if you want a layer of abstraction across like 7 different, kind of layer types of infrastructure, Linkerd there's gonna be friction there. And then the other kind of component is, and this is service mesh kind of more generally, the stuff that we can really help with is in synchronous communication, right? In kind of these transaction-based systems. So I'm serving a website I'm serving, an API. I've got an API server. I'm doing something where there is a consumer, often a human, that has made a request and is waiting like 500 milliseconds max for a response. And anything that's outside of that, when we get into like offline batch processing or machine learning training or whatever, there's stuff we can do. It's just not as, and again, this is a service mesh as a whole, not just Linkerd. The stuff we can do is just not as valuable. It's really that synchronous kind of transaction-based model that the service mesh shines. And happily, like that's almost every website and API server in the world. So there's a lot there.
So thank you for describing that. By the way, that was very useful because I think that helps kind of focus the problem, right? That people who are watching this might be thinking, well, is this right for me, or is this? But that does kind of narrow it down. And I wanted to touch on reliability topic briefly, if you'll allow me, because this is something I'm very passionate about is reliability. I actually was talking to somebody last week who said that now the difference between open source and commercial software is reliability. That really this is the thing people are paying for, right? That if you, because to your point about open core, blocking features versus reliability. And we were talking before the camera started a little bit about SLOs and how service mesh can kind of make for the SLO data, the service level objectives. I should spell it out, right? But service level objectives, SLOs, having that connected to service mesh, that makes it a lot easier to collect the data. Can you just describe a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so here's how I think about it. And if you want to read a very long version of my opinions, I have a Meshifesto on servicemesh.io. The service mesh solves a set of observability problems, right? And they are observability problems. It's not the complete set, right? There's stuff that your application still has to do. There's stuff that you still need to monitor CPU and whatever. But the layer that the service mesh can solve around there is we can give you kind of the golden metrics on a per service basis, things like success rate and latency and request volumes and some other things. And the important part is that the service mesh can give those to you in a way that is independent of what the application is actually doing, independent of the code of the application, independent of who wrote it or what they did, right? It's all done at the platform layer and it's done uniformly across your entire stack. So every service that gets deployed, if Linkerd is there, you get the same exact level of observability and you get the same metrics. And the reason why I think that's valuable for kind of the SLO case, where you want to build on top of these metrics to kind of tie, the metrics by themselves are like, oh, I'm at 99% success rate. Is that good? Is that bad? Like, I don't know. You have to put context in there, organizational context, right? And that's where SLOs come in. Is you're basically you're placing organizational context on top of it. And you're saying, this is what I'm expecting, and here's how you're doing. But the reason why I think that's really valuable for SLOs is that a lot of the value, at least in my mind, of SLOs is that same level of uniformity, right? We don't want to have every developer do their own custom thing, and then everything's kind of, asynchronous and like, we're tying our SLOs to our pay raises or whatever. Like, uniformity is the real value of the service mesh, and I think that directly is useful to building any kind of layer on top of that. Does that make sense?
Very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I have one last question for you to talk about, and we can wrap up here. But when you're looking across tech more broadly, we talked a lot about service mesh, but the idea of meritocracy in tech, the idea that we have an open environment where the best ideas, the best technology, the best solutions win. I think that's coming under scrutiny these days. And I think the question is really like, what can leaders like yourself do, and leaders like me too? I mean, I don't want, but I would like to get your perspective on this. Leaders like you could do to welcome new and diverse perspectives into the industry. What do you say to people who are either struggling to enter the field or entering the field right now to make sure that we are creating the right kind of open, transparent, diverse environment where people can succeed?
Okay, I think we have a perfect meritocracy already. The money that everyone makes is directly related to their value to society, and we kind of solved this, right? Everything's fine.
We solved it. Okay, you heard it here. No,
yeah. I think meritocracy is like maybe it's an aspirational goal, but it's certainly not the state of the world today. So, what would I say to someone coming in? I'm often, I guess, I have a reputation as being a grumpy person, but this is another thing where I'm actually really optimistic. Right. I think the tech industry has a huge set of problems, but unlike other industries, I think we are much more aware of what those problems are, right? And we have I think that awareness is kind of the first step towards saying, okay, maybe this is something that we can actually address. So I do believe that, although we're not in a perfect meritocracy by any means, if you are coming into this, into like let's say the cloud native space, especially, which I think has done a particularly good job. Not perfect, but a particularly good job of showing off kind of the diversity of, kind of backgrounds and people involved in the field. I think you are probably going to have a better, you're going to be in a better situation here than you would be in almost any other field. Now, that's not to say, and I have to keep hedging, that's not to say that we are, anywhere near where we want to be, but I actually think it's better here than elsewhere. And I think that the way to keep improving it is to keep the focus on, who are we bringing in? Are we making sure that everyone has equal access to opportunity? Are we, doing our best to kind of amplify the voices of the people who historically have not had their voices amplified? Are we spending our time and energy in the right way to build the future that we want to build together? So overall, I am optimistic. I think it requires a whole lot of work, and this is something that we spend, at Buoyant, we certainly spend a lot of time and energy on, both on the Linkerd side, trying to make sure that we have a really inclusive and supportive community, but also on the Buoyant side, where we're actually, paying people to do stuff. It's hard, but it has to be done. So that's my summary.
Thank you very much, William. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on. You think you'll come on again? What do you think?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I would love to. This is great. Yeah.
Thanks, William. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Kip Merker here from Noble 9, signing off.